So welcome. This is Mac from the company Mac Ferments. My project focuses on promotion of fermented foods with the goal of empowering people with knowledge and tools to make and choose these types of products more often. And January is a special time when I'm hosting a miso month, exploring the history, applications, and the future of miso and koji-based products. And for that reason, I invited our guest today, Ole Mouritsen, for a little chat about the subject. Ole, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. I'd love to build this interview on two segments. First, to talk about your professional career and work in the field of food innovation and Danish gastronomy. And then later to focus on the subject of umami, koji, and miso. So let's jump straight into it. Ole, you are a professor in gastrophysics and food innovation at the Department of Food Science at the University of Copenhagen, with a long list of articles, research papers, and book publications regarding the subject. But how did your journey with gastronomy start?
It goes a long way back. My original field is really not food science and taste. I'm a physicist, a theoretical physicist, and I have for many years been working on various aspects of physics and physical chemistry, going all the way from what we call hard condensed matter into more soft materials. And among the soft materials that are very prominent are those we eat. That is, that's the organisms from biology. And I've for many years been interested in the physics of the mechanism of cells and how cells interact with their environment. And from that, it's actually a small step into food, because food is, that's first of all, that's the part of the world we eat, which is fundamental. And that part of the world we eat is of organic origin. That is, it's either plants or animals or fungi or algae. And the physics behind these systems is general physics, and you can use the principles from physics and physical chemistry in studying these systems as well. And from there on to food, scientifically, I would say it's a small step. I've for many years been interested in cooking. I like to cook myself. And gradually, and it actually starts a long way back, I got interested in Japanese cuisine and Japanese food culture. And I sort of gradually, when I made science communication, because also for many years I've been interested in communicating about science and scientific principles, I learned that talking about food in relation to the way humans interact with food, that's a good way of getting people's interest, not least the young people. And so I actually started working on food as a part of science communication. And it's really only over the last maybe 5-8 years, I've been taking that also to do scientific work within food. So it's a gradual and long transition, which very much, large extent, has fueled my interest in Japanese cuisine, which I'm sure we're coming back to when we're going to talk about miso and koji. Right. And I have quite early also started interacting with professional chefs who know about how to prepare food and how to taste food. So I learned a lot from them. And in recent years, my interest has been both in describing what food is, the kind of food we eat, in particular the taste and texture, but also how one can use this insight to do different things. For instance, look at foodstuff which is less common to eat in our part of the world, or which is quite important at the moment. That is, how can one use the insight in food and taste to further in a green transition? That is, basically, how can we eat more green using insight in food and food taste? And you asked about gastronomy. My view on gastronomy is that I think of gastronomy as a way to fuel the interest in working with food as a scientist. So we start talking about a field we call gastrophysics, which is sort of the physics or physical chemistry behind gastronomy, such that it's not food science at large, it's not sensory science, it's not sort of production, but it's more based on what one can call gastronomically inspired or gastronomical induced questions, which is quite different. For instance, if you want to make a package of food, if the focus is here to study something that it has gastronomical value, and then add and apply scientific principles to understand how can you maybe design new types of food, how can you be innovative or understand what is happening when the human interact with food and perceive food and taste food. So gastronomy and science, and also the basic sciences, is sort of, in my viewpoint, it's sort of become one, and very much driven by my interest in cooking as an amateur.
Mm. That's so interesting, and this sounds like an amazing lifetime journey. I also think that the connection between science and gastronomy, what you just said, it became one in your perspective. For me, it's also very strongly interrelated, and I think both fields, both groups of people can benefit from working together. And you also mentioned, and I found something in the web as well about Japan. And okay, so you've been appointed the Japanese Cuisine Goodwill Ambassador by the Japanese Ministry of Agriculture. And I actually wanted to dig a little deeper into what's your relationship with Japan?
As I said earlier, I'm passionate about Japanese cooking, and I learned about Japanese food before, a long time before I actually started first going to Japan. But over the years, I've been to Japan quite a number of times. In the early times, because I was going to physics conferences and meeting physicists, but in later years also with people who work on food and food science, and also people who work with the kind of food stuff we don't use that much in this part of the world, for instance, seaweeds. So over the years, I've got quite a number of contacts among people who work with various aspects of food. So seaweeds is one, and umami is another one. So I have a number of contacts to professional people in the food area and in the scientific area in Japan. And I also have quite a number of some more personal friends, Japanese either in Japan or abroad, who have sort of taught me about Japanese food culture. And I suspect that the nomination to be Japanese Food Goodwill Ambassador is based on the work I've been doing over the years to promote in this part of the world, not only Denmark, but also wider, and understanding of Japanese food culture. And actually it started way back, I think in 2007, when I wrote my first published science book on food, and that was actually the science behind sushi. Mm-hmm. And that book became quite widespread. So first written in Danish, but also came out in English and German. And by the way, that's the way of sort of speaking about Japanese culture goes very much via sort of communication. So I like to write books and write published science papers about Japanese food culture, and also giving talks. I give a lot of talks of Japanese food culture, and the books I've been writing over the years on various aspects of food has a large component inspired by Japanese food culture and Japanese cooking. And I think my major triumph as a popular science writer was when my book on Mouthfeel was actually translated into Japanese and came out in Japan. And this is not something common for Western scientists to sort of bring knowledge about food culture to Japan, because the way Japanese perceive their culture is such that it's usually said that foreigners can't really understand what's going on in Japanese food culture. And maybe that's true, maybe I can't, but at least the book made it to the Japanese market, which I'm quite proud of, actually.
That's very impressive. Yeah. And on the other hand, you're also the president of the Danish Gastronomical Academy, right?
That's right.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, what is the role of this organization in the country? And also, to what extent is fermentation incorporated into its activities or curriculum?
The Danish Gastronomy Academy is a small academy, and it's not that old. It's 55 years old, and it doesn't have a lot of activities, but it's sort of the stronghold of gastronomy in Denmark, in the sense that at different periods of time it has had large impacts on Danish gastronomy, and so it varies very much depending on who is members of the academy and what kind of activities they have. The academy as such, the major, over the recent years, the major impact on gastronomy is, why I would say two things. One is to produce the first encyclopedia in Danish on gastronomical topics. It's ended up in a big book, which is now also on the internet. So if you look up gastrolex.dk, you have a wealth of information defining gastronomical terms. So I think that's a major service to the society. Another, and this is an annual thing, that is that we hand out honorary diploma new movers in Danish gastronomy. And so we usually have 6 or 8 nominees every year that do all sorts of things, from developing new products to promoting knowledge about gastronomy, writing books. And in the early days also, chefs could get such diploma, but that we've stopped because there's so many good chefs, so it really doesn't make much sense to give it to chefs and restaurants. So it's more sort of say new products, new ways of thinking. We not only talk about high-end gastronomy, we actually talk about how gastronomy can be sort of a mover in modern society. It could, for instance, also be sort of developing communal meals that is based on good food for many people. Mm-hmm. So there are many ways, and I encourage people to look at our webpage for the Academy, and you can see what kind of people, and we talk about individuals here. We give it to people, not to activities, give it to people, because those are the ones who drive the gastronomical scene.
Yeah, we should, I'll definitely add the links to the website, and should definitely check it out. And I think that the last thing I wanted to ask you personally is the project, or actually the Research and Communication Center Taste for Life, or Smaak for Livet. Can you shortly explain the mission of this center?
The mission is very simple, because the mission is to convey knowledge about taste. And then people say, how can you run a big center? And we got a very big grant from the Nordea Foundation to run this center over 7.5 years. It's just terminated, by the way, at the end of last year. And the focus is here, nutrition. And when it actually comes to describing or appreciating food, our language is extremely poor with respect to actually how to describe it. And so a part of the center's activity is focused on young persons, I mean children, and people in the educational system, to give them sort of an understanding on their senses. So it really starts with the senses. And when we call it taste, or Taste for Life, as a center called, it's taste in sort of the Danish sense, that it covers all the 5 basic senses. So it's not what's happening. You learn about food, and you learn about your environment, you learn about other people, you learn about yourself, just listening to the senses. tasting, feeling, hearing, seeing, and smelling. And
oops, that's something on the line or a broken line.
So the idea behind Taste for Life is that we want to teach people how to use their senses to interact with the world around them, and food is a national place to start. And it's basically very basic, because the senses is the only way we can interact with the environment. It's the way we learn about ourselves, others, and also the part of the world we eat. So we have been developing teaching materials for schools and on all levels in the elementary school, and also in high school, such that you can basically learn all disciplines using taste as a starter, whether it's history or natural sciences, language, domestic science, of course. And so that's basically the idea. And the reason why this is an interesting and good approach is that we talk about something that is massively interdisciplinary. And what is well known is that if you want to make people have people to interact across boundaries, different disciplines, it's always a trouble, because people sit in each silo and there's a barrier. So the idea with Taste for Life is that we move into neutral ground, and taste and the senses is neutral ground. Everyone has something to say about the senses. We all have our senses, and if you start there, a lot of the boundaries for interaction between people is sort of removed, and it's everyone can see themselves on this neutral scene, and then something is happening. It releases an enormous amount of dynamics. And we have the last part we're still working on, that is also taken to the level of the chef schools, and which is well known. There's an enormous need to recruiting more young people to the crafts, in particular within food science. So we're trying to sort of make a new curriculum based on a deeper understanding of what's happening in the kitchen, such that you not only use recipes because you're told to use recipes. That's the way we always done. We try to build some understanding in why you add this and how come you do this or do that. And in fact, fermentation is an important part of this new curriculum, which is a very powerful way of transforming foodstuff and its nutritional capacity, as well as his taste, and also the way you can keep for a longer time. So that's actually part of it. And there's some need for an understanding on what's actually happening when you do, in this case, fermentation, but it could all sort of other preparations in the kitchen. And apart from that, the center has been out on all sort of festivals and in streets and talking to people, working with young people, doing all sorts of activities to promote a deeper understanding on what we actually mean when we taste food. So that's the idea. And then the hallmark of the center is that it brings together people from very different backgrounds. We have people in philosophy and language, natural sciences and sensory sciences. We have teachers, educators, communicators, social sciences. And this is what I think we've demonstrated, that if we really want to move an agenda along these lines, you have to bring the people together from many different fields, and you have to do it in a setting where these people find that the dynamics is interesting enough for them in order to move out of their comfort zone.
Yeah, I also think that different target groups, people who you're trying to communicate the mission, they also perceive things in a different way. So you have to adjust the level of particular details or emphasize one thing over another. And I'm really happy to hear that you obviously incorporate the fermentation part to the curriculum, because I think kids or young people definitely should learn or get to know about fermentation as early as possible. I come from Poland, where sauerkraut or fermented lacto-fermented products were always there. So I just grew up taking it for granted that it's just part of our diet.
You have Zurich.
I'm sorry?
You have Zurich in Poland.
Yeah,
Zurich?
yeah,
Yeah.
Zurich is our traditional. It's a sourdough soup.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, it's so common that these days kids really are not that willing to try new things, in a sense that fermented foods are sometimes funky, they taste completely different, they look different. So it's very important what Taste for Life does to make young people understand these things. Right. That's so fascinating. I'm really excited being here talking with you, Ole. I wanted to go into the second part where we're going to focus particularly on the subject of umami, koji, and miso. So here the first question would be, in your opinion, what's the general perception of umami in Denmark?
The word and concept is used more and more often, also to the extent that you will see in newspapers and magazines and the public speak that people mention the word without feeling they have to explain what it is. And this is something that has taken place over the last 10, maybe 15 years. And I believe I've done something myself to help this transition, because together with Chef Klaus Dürbeck, I wrote a book called Umami, which was quite popular, and I think it helped sort of bringing the term out further out. And in fact, also in Taste for Life, we've taught the children what umami is. I would say most people still struggle with understanding what it actually is. And just to give you an example, if you talk about umami, and then say, well, it's a basic taste, and you find it in this and this and that, and it's elicited, produced by certain compounds in the food. And then people would look at you and say, well, but what is it really? And then the way I usually handle that is that I say, we would not have had this discussion if we've been talking about sweet. If you say sweet and I say sweet, we expect that the other one know exactly what it is. I don't have to say sweet like sugar. I don't have to say sour like lemon. Mm-hmm. And that's because these other four basic tastes, salty, sweet, bitter, and sour, they are what we call encoded in the language. It's something you can use without having to explain. This is different with umami. It's still not encoded in the language. And the other trouble is that it's quite often sort of misused, in the sense that when because people know that umami, maybe also they know the Japanese root, but actually umami means delicious taste, or the scent of delicious taste in Japanese. Mm-hmm. And most people would know that umami is related to deliciousness. But it's not the other way around. You can easily have delicious food without it having any umami. So quite people often say if there's something they like, it's not only delicious, but actually something they like, they say it's umami. But of course, liking of food is different from actually the taste, because liking and preference, that's something that is controlled by culture and ethnicity and tradition and commensality, whereas the basic taste are something that is physiological controlled. So umami is difficult because it's interchanged with deliciousness, and it happen all. You also find it with professional. I mean, chefs. They even design product, and they say it's umami this and this and that. But if you look at the contents, I would say as a scientist, it does not have those compounds which we know produce umami. So now we're moving into sort of the technical part of what umami actually is, which components in food can elicit umami. And this is, of course, extremely important when we talk about fermentation. And also, it's quite important to realize that umami is a basic taste. And by definition, a basic taste is a taste that cannot be produced by the other basic tastes. That is, you cannot, by taking the foodstuff that is sweet and salty and bitter and sour, and combine them and produce umami. That's per definition, it's not possible. Mm-hmm. But you can easily have a combination of the four basic tastes: salty, sweet, bitter, and sour, and produce something that is delicious, but it may not be umami. And I think that's the trouble. There's also another issue, and that is that, and this was actually highlighted more than 100 years ago when the Japanese scientist Kikuno Ikeda, he first proposed umami as a basic taste. He says you have to pay attention to your taste when you figure out what umami is, because usually umami is hidden underneath other tastes. And if you just take an example, tomato, a sun-ripe tomato is very rich in the compounds that elicit umami. Mm-hmm. But when you eat a tomato, I think most people will say a ripe tomato, it's sweet. There might be a little bit of bitterness. It could also be sour depending on the maturity. And most people wouldn't say umami because there are other stronger tastes that is overruling umami. And you will only find, if you pay attention to it, that when you eat a tomato, after a little while, when all the sweetness and maybe bitterness, if sourness, if there's something of that, when they've gone, there's something lingering. There's something left back in the oral cavity, and that's umami. And that's a characteristic of umami. It has a long duration, very different from the other ones. For instance, if you compare to sour, that's very quick. You get something sour and then it disappears. But umami, it's sort of sneaking in, mm-hmm. coming very slowly. So that's why it's difficult to sort of identify. But on the other hand, this long lingering is exactly what makes it such a wonderful and pleasant experience.
So I wanted to ask you also about your perception regarding koji-based or koji-derived products and their future in food sector, or particularly in Danish food production or food innovation?
I mean, I think koji is the God's gift to man, because it's a wonderful mold, and it has a long, old tradition in Asia. Started in China, and then from there moved to Japan. We mostly know it from Japanese products, but the mold is used throughout Asia, and now also beginning to come into the Western world. And it does these wonderful things by its enzymes. So the mold has enzymes that can break down proteins into amino acids and peptides that have umami flavor, and some even kokumi, which we may talk about as well. And it can also break down carbohydrates into sugars that give sweetness. And this is something which is very important to keep in mind, because if we take a bean product, and we're told to eat more legumes, more bælgfrugter. The trouble is with these in their raw fresh state, they don't have much flavor. They're mostly uninteresting. Mm-hmm. But that's not because they don't have they have the potential to be interesting flavor-wise, because they have proteins with amino acids, but as long as the amino acids are on the proteins, they have no taste. So proteins don't have taste. The same thing with carbohydrates. They don't have taste because the sugars abound in the carbohydrates. You have to have them released, and that is also some do carbohydrates into sugar. So usually you will find that when you apply koji to a product of plant origin, it could be a bean, but it could also be another vegetable, where you both have proteins and carbohydrates. You release both umami taste, and you also release sugars that give sweetness. Mm-hmm. So these are two wonderful things the koji can do. In fact, it does other things too, also to fatty acids. And maybe there's something important to add here, which I think really should be part of the story about umami. It is known that if you sort of crank up the umami in a piece of foodstuff, whatever bitterness you got in the food is actually perceived as less bitter. And this is important to know, because when we talk about eating more green, quite often plant-based food have bitterness because that's the way the plants make sure that we don't eat them. So that's uphill to eat bitter foodstuff like in various vegetables like cabbages. But if you can induce umami by the koji mold, you'll also cut the top of the perceived bitterness, and the effect is very dramatic. So I would claim this is what we've been doing in Tasteful Life with the children. We can get children to eat broccoli with no problem if the broccoli has been subjected to koji for a day or two in the refrigerator. Then it's sweet and it's umami flavor, and the bitterness is basically very strongly diminished. So that's sort of the trick with koji, and of course it has been used in the capacity for turning carbohydrates to sugars is something one can take advantage of if you make fermented beverages. And that's exactly the way you do it in sake, because sake is based on rice, and rice, you cannot ferment rice by yeast unless you turn the carbohydrates into sugars. Basically, a similar thing you do when you make beer, because there you use by malting process, the enzymes in the grain to break down the carbohydrates into sugars, and then the yeast can come along and ferment to alcohol. So you can get an alcoholic beverages. So I think koji is something we should all learn about, and it's also gradually moving into the Western cuisine. A lot of restaurants are using it, and there are more products also of local origin coming on the market that actually uses not soybeans, which is the common thing in Asia, but also using other pulses, other plant-based foodstuff that is rich in proteins. But the umami potential needs to be unlocked in order to be flavorful.
This answer opens up a few more questions. Very interesting. But first of all, kokumi. What is kokumi?
Kokumi, yet another Japanese word which is certainly not encoded in our language. And the way the Japanese describe it is, when it comes to the sensory perception, it's something which has it's filling the mouth, so it's out of sort of body to the food, long-lasting, continuous food experience. So it's kind of a wall-to-wall experience, which has some overlap with umami, and that makes it even more difficult to sort of understand what it is. We now know that it's small protein fragments, so-called dipeptides and tripeptides in the food that elicit kokumi. And kokumi is not a taste, it's actually a way of enhancing taste. So these compounds can actually enhance both sweetness, but also saltiness, and in particular umami in food. So if you have some food with little umami, you can enhance it by adding something that contains these kokumi peptides. And in fact, the kokumi peptides, it's something that is very new and it hasn't been studied that much, but it's in particular in fermented products, you find these peptides. And that is, for instance, in soy sauce and in fish sauce and also in some cheeses. So these peptides are produced along with the free amino acids. So you basically have a cocktail. And you not only produce umami, but you also produce compounds that enhance umami. And that makes it sort of an extra bonus in fermented products. And for instance, miso, and I mentioned soy sauce, they have this extra bonus. And that's why they're so potent in eliciting umami. So once you think of kokumi as a kind of an attribute, something that is add to something else. And the striking thing is that these compounds that elicit kokumi, if you have it in a pure form, they have no taste. So some talk about them as more like taste enhancers. They cannot do something on their own. They have to add in to something you already got there.
Right. And how do you perceive the position of miso paste in Western cultures?
I think it's. I don't have the data for the market, but I have a feeling it's on the move, and I think it will be promoted when miso-like products based on local produce is made. And I myself advocate the viewpoint that miso is if you have miso or miso-like products, there is no excuse not to eat more green, because what the miso can do, it can add to the green stuff, the plant-based material, what it hasn't got itself. So everyone who's tried to make a dressing, and it's dead easy to make a dressing of a miso product by just maybe stirring in some water or maybe some sake, or some would even use a little bit oil if they want some creaminess, and then use that as a sauce or dressing to vegetables. Then it's a completely different meal. So I think it's miso is a way of making it possible to eat more green. And I think that is a mission I would like to promote, and I think everyone should try. And those who tried it say, "Wow, I would never have thought that." Mm-hmm. And it's umami that does the trick. That is what makes the vegetables more edible, by using miso products. And of course, soups is a traditional thing in Asia. You have miso soups, but you could also, of course, make it of other fermented products, and they are very delicious, very satisfying, very sating in a meal.
So we agree that without data, but data does back up the claim that miso is on the rise, miso is on the grow. But people in Europe don't really relate, or are not that willing to use miso in daily cooking. It's more, it has connotations towards like soy sauce. If I'm using soy sauce, today I'm gonna cook Asian for dinner. So is that a problem of lack of education, or lack of communication towards these products like miso or shio koji in Europe?
Yeah. I think there are many things that comes in here. I would say one should start with very mild miso. I mean, a sweet, mild miso with not too potent aromas, because there's something one should also add in. That is, when you have fermentation, you not only form these taste compounds, but you also form aroma compounds. And this is well known for cheeses. I mean, you get wonderful tasting cheese, but it can be smelly. And the same thing with fermented products. So I think the way to go in our society is that one should start with the white misos, the more sweet misos, the more mild in terms of aroma, but which are equally potent in umami. I understand what you mean, that if people think of this as sort of, now they're cooking Asian, that's a challenge. And maybe one should then put it in different contexts. And I think, I mean, one place what one can sort of think of putting it into the market is to team up with those who make the meal boxes, the meal kits for people, where they actually get something as a condiment to go with the meal boxes, which is in the Danish context, you would call it a sauce, something that is the flavor giver to a meal, and that meal could be green. So if one talks about a sauce or a dressing, and maybe you could coin other words. I mean, I don't know. I found a similar obstacle when I tell people that an easy way to get umami is to use nutritional yeast, that is yeast flakes, which is very rich in umami. But then when you say yeast, people think of yeast flavors, but the nutritional yeast do not really have much yeast flavors. So it's more in sort of it's more in the brain that you think it's something that is yeast. It need not be yeast in terms of flavor. So I think that's something one should ponder with the miso. Maybe you should call it something else. And in fact, since I guess it's true that miso, the word miso, is something that is always tied to soybeans, which you may not want to use in the local context. You want to use the local legumes that you have, pulses you have in for instance in Denmark. Maybe once you think of another word, call it something else, call it umami dressing. I don't know. I mean, to sort of remove the barriers such that people will taste it, and once they've tasted it, they would not have bad connotation about something smelly fermented stuff.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's a long way ahead for us in educating and communicating these things, because in my opinion, if we alter the name of miso into amino paste or umami paste, then we still have to focus on explaining umami or amino acids. So either way, it's a process, learning process for the communities. But I think people like you or producers of these products are on a good way to reaching their goals. I think
I mean, with the words of Taste for Life, we would say, well, just taste it and tell me what you think about it. And you're welcome to say I don't like it, but if you say so, please tell me why. So, and it's not a matter of forcing people to eat it, but usually I would say, well, suppose you never had chocolate and haven't given you a chance to taste it. Wow, what you're really missing. So it's a matter of being open, but it is a long haul with communicating new food stuff to a population, and it usually takes decades to transform. But I think maybe the chance is there now, because everyone knows that there is a green agenda because of the climate, and people really would like to eat more green, but it's uphill. And that's why I and others, and last year I put out, or 2020 put out a book with my chef colleague Klaus Stürbæk about green, where we describe that umami is the key to eating more green. And here miso or miso-like products is one of the most easy way to bring deliciousness to plant-based material.
Mm-hmm. And you also mentioned part where chefs should be in the picture, obviously. But what do you think is what's the role of restaurants and chefs in promoting fermentation and koji-based products?
I think a lot of restaurants are already doing it. They have a sort of a small fermentation thing going on. For instance, a lot of, I mean, not koji, of course, but sourdough. I mean, once people learn that producing sour bread by sourdough is really based on fermentation, it opened up new eyes. And I see more and more sort of miso-like paste in restaurants where it's used for basically anything from soups to desserts and everything what is in between. And also learning how to use koji in a restaurant setting, I think is something that is moving. I myself, when it comes to propagating knowledge about the wonders of koji to the general public, there's always the issue that running a koji culture, you need a thermostatic device, and you have to control temperature. You have to be sure that you don't get any wrong microorganisms in. But then there's this wonderful staple shio koji, the koji with salted koji, that basically only have the enzymes of the koji, which is really the only thing you need if you want to work with vegetable dishes. So there's no fermentation, there's no microbial activity going on, but there's an enzymatic activity, which is what you need to turn protein into amino acids and carbohydrates into sugars. And that's an easy way. And as a physicist or scientist, I'm always careful with predicting about the future. But the lowest level of using koji is via shio koji. And that I can see it's now coming into some Danish stores, and I see in abroad, it's going to be a common staple you'll find on the shelf, where you also find soy sauce and sake, food grade sake, and maybe fish sauces, and it's a sort of something you can easily use in the home kitchen without having to work with a microorganism. So I think that may be sort of an inroad to koji, but for an ordinary household to have koji, that will be only for those who are really very keen on getting the full flavor, because there's a difference between using the shio koji and using the real koji culture. It's much more, the koji culture and the flavor compounds there from the fresh koji is much more rich.
Mm-hmm.
But communication is the way, and taste. I mean, tasting, giving people examples of how it tastes, promote the product wherever you can, kind of food festivals, and as I mentioned in context with Taste for Life, we're doing in the educational setting, so the children learn about this, and then in a young, when they get in the young age, they'll probably maybe have a broader acceptance of new products in the future.
Right. Yeah. I have one more question for you, and it's more on the nutritional side, or it's health related, maybe I would say, because there are research papers showing the health benefits of habitual consumption of miso in form of miso soup in Japan. The research was based in Japan. But is consumption of miso healthy from the perspective of salt intake? Because we know that miso contains from 6 up to 16% of salt, and eating it every day could be somehow related to health issues such as high blood pressure.
Yeah, that's, of course, you would not have a full meal of miso. The miso is a condiment, and it's something that can mediate something else, that it, as I mentioned, making it possible to eat more green stuff, which we know on the balance is a more healthy diet. But of course, salt is a concern. I don't know if it's such a concern as there's still I think the jury is still out there how problematic it is, but generally one would say not too much salt. So one should think of it as a condiment, something that you use a little of, so, and can help other food stuff go down more easily. And certainly when it comes using the mold to transform other food stuff beyond the miso into amino acids, we know they're more easily accessible nutrients. So that's part of the nutritional profile of the fermentation. And we know, and there's also studies, that's also Japanese studies, that it seems to do also something to the mental capacity of, in particular, people with dementia and old people, that they get a larger part of free amino acids in their diet. And that's also something which probably is worthwhile looking into more as we get in populations that are older and older, and it is an issue with mental abilities as we get older. I'm not an expert in nutrition, and certainly not in health, so that's basically what I would say. But it's generally accepted that a certain level of miso fermented products in the diet is, on the balance, positive for health. But of course, food is sort of a zero-sum play. If you add more of something, you eat less of another thing. So I still think that umami is the key to eating a more balanced, healthy diet with more plant-based ingredients.
Great answer as well. Ole, I think we should wrap up here. Any words to inspire people watching that you would like to share at the end as well? Apart from the whole inspirational talk, because it was great.
I think you go out there and use your senses and try to taste some of this stuff and judge for yourself. whether you find this something which is pleasant. And I think that's my advice. Go out, taste, and do it together with other people and discuss what you find out and what you learn, and realize that in the current discussion about sustainable eating and sustainable food, there's no food that is healthy, sustainable, and nutritious before it's eaten. It has to get through the barriers in the mouth, and it has to be eaten. As long as it's out there, it's basically waste from the point of view of food. So that's why you have to focus on something you like. And umami, and as it may come out from fermented products, that's the gateway to actually making food sustainable.
Yes. Ole, thank you so much again for your time and
Most
sharing the
welcome.
perspective. It was a great pleasure. I'm gonna share the links to the things we talked about as well, and definitely follow your journey and try to get connected as often as possible. Thanks again.
Good luck, and good luck with the company.
Thanks.
Bye.